Welcome, history enthusiasts. Today we drift deep into one of the most thrilling moments of military history, the Battle of Marengo, where Napoleon faced 12 grueling hours of near defeat and turned it into an extraordinary victory. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss these epic journeys through time. Grab a seat, because the story we're about to unfold is full of strategy, courage, and a masterclass in leadership that changed the course of history. It was early summer in 1800, a time when Europe was teetering on the edge of chaos. The French Republic, forged in revolution and tempered by decades of internal strife, had emerged from its own turmoil to assert power across the continent. Yet, for all its victories, it faced threats on multiple fronts, and none was more pressing than in northern Italy, where Austrian forces sought to reclaim influence lost during previous campaigns. In this delicate geopolitical moment, Napoleon Bonaparte, a man whose name was beginning to echo across Europe, returned from the deserts and cities of Egypt to the lands of Italy. He had been absent for months, leading an ambitious campaign that had tested both his strategic genius and his capacity for endurance. His army, though fewer in numbers than the Austrians they were to face, was disciplined, loyal, and seasoned. In the art of warfare, they were a reflection of Napoleon himself, unyielding, adaptive, and driven by a vision of conquest and legacy. Napoleon's arrival in Italy was urgent. He understood that the Austrians were reorganizing, regaining strength, and that time was against him. The French forces under his command numbered 28,000, formidable contingent, but still slightly outmatched by the Austrian army, which totaled 30,000 soldiers. On June 14, 1800, the two forces were poised to collide near a small town called Marengo, located in the rich plains of northern Italy. These plains, fertile and flat, seemed innocent enough to a casual observer, but to commanders and soldiers alike, they represented both an opportunity and a peril. The soil, recently soaked by spring rains, threatened to slow troop movements and artillery, turning the battlefield into a challenging theater where strategy, endurance, and timing would be tested to their limits. Napoleon surveyed the landscape with a keen, almost preternatural eye. He noticed the gentle undulations of the terrain, the positioning of distant woods, and the potential avenues of both attack and retreat. Every detail mattered. For a man like Napoleon, the battlefield was not merely a place of conflict, where every decision, every maneuver could alter the fate of nations. The French army, though disciplined, carried the scars of previous campaigns. Some soldiers had fought in Egypt, enduring harsh climates, disease, and exhausting marches. Others were fresh recruits, eager but untested. Napoleon knew the mental and physical state of his troops would be decisive in the hours to come. He walked among them before the battle, observing faces lined with anticipation, anxiety, and resolve. Leadership, he understood, was as much about inspiring courage as it was about issuing orders. The morale of the soldiers was fragile, yet resilient. It depended heavily on their faith in him. Every nod, every word of encouragement, every strategic insight he shared reinforced the invisible thread that connected commander and soldier in this delicate equilibrium. The fate of the French army teetered on the edge. A single misstep could shatter it. A single moment of clarity could elevate it to extraordinary triumph. as the morning sun broke through a thin layer of clouds, casting light on the fields near Marengo, the sounds of war began to stir. Scouts reported Austrian movements, the distant beat of drums and the faint echo of bugle calls signaling the enemy's preparation. Napoleon listened intently to each report, weighing information against intuition. He understood the Austrians to be confident, perhaps overconfident, in their numerical advantage. He knew that confidence could be both a strength and a fatal flaw. While their initial assaults might overwhelm the French, their overextension could create vulnerabilities. Napoleon's mind worked not in hours or minutes, but in sequences of possibilities, assessing contingencies, anticipating reactions, and preparing for every conceivable scenario. For him, the battle was not a mere confrontation. It was a complex puzzle, demanding intellect, foresight, and nerve. By mid-morning, the first clash began. Austrian columns advanced, moving with the precision of well-drilled soldiers. Yet, under the weight of their own overconfidence, the French lines braced, muskets ready, cannons positioned strategically to maximize impact. The air was thick with tension. Every heartbeat felt magnified. Every whisper of movement carried weight. Napoleon remained at the center, a calm eye in the storm, issuing commands, repositioning units, and observing the unfolding chaos. He understood the psychological dimension of battle. Fear could paralyze, hesitation could be fatal, and the mere presence of a leader could inspire soldiers to acts of extraordinary courage. His calmness, however, was not born of detachment, but of intense focus honed over years of study, observation, and personal experience in both triumph and adversity. The battle quickly escalated. Cannons roared, sending clouds of smoke into the air, obscuring vision and amplifying the confusion. The crack of musket fire punctuated the din, while cavalry units maneuvered to flank positions, their horses pounding the soft, wet earth. French soldiers, trained in discipline and drilled in tactics, struggled to maintain cohesion under the pressure. Some faltered, others pressed forward with grim determination. The Austrian forces, sensing an early advantage, pressed the attack. For a moment, it seemed that Napoleon's army might be pushed back entirely. The first hours were a blur of movement, strategy, and raw human endurance. For Napoleon, every decision had to balance aggression with caution, daring with prudence. A single miscalculation could lead to catastrophe, yet hesitation could squander an opportunity for decisive action. As the morning unfolded, Napoleon's leadership became increasingly crucial. He moved along the lines, addressing officers, encouraging soldiers, and personally observing the effectiveness of artillery fire. His presence was magnetic. Soldiers reported later that simply seeing him resolute and composed amidst the chaos gave them renewed strength. Leadership, Napoleon knew, was not merely about issuing orders. It was about embodying the resolve and clarity that others could emulate. The bond between commander and troops was a living, breathing force, visible yet powerful, capable of sustaining morale even when the tide of battle seemed against them. In this sense, the first hours of Marengo were as much about psychological endurance as they were about physical combat. The terrain played a subtle but crucial role. Rolling fields, shallow depressions, and scattered woods created both opportunities and hazards. Artillery placements were influenced by subtle rises in the ground. while cavalry charges were constrained by the soft, rain-soaked soil. Napoleon's knowledge of these factors allowed him to anticipate movements, protect vulnerable units, and exploit weaknesses in the Austrian lines. Geography, in his hands, was not static. It became part of a living strategy, integrated seamlessly into the broader plan of engagement. Every ridge, every ditch, every stand of trees was a factor to consider, a variable to manipulate in the unfolding contest of skill, endurance, and will. At the same time, the larger political and historical context weighed heavily on Napoleon's mind. Success or failure at Marengo would not only influence the outcome of the campaign in Italy, but could also shape the trajectory of his personal career. The French Republic had experienced decades of upheaval. It needed victories to sustain legitimacy and to consolidate power. For Napoleon, the battle was more than a military engagement. It was a test of destiny. He understood that history often remembers not the hours of struggle, but the decisive moments that transform adversity into triumph. Marengo offered such a moment, but only if it could be recognized, seized, and exploited with clarity and courage. By late morning, the battle had settled into a tense rhythm. The French army, though under pressure, had not collapsed. Small skirmishes flared along the lines, artillery duels intensified, and cavalry units probed for weaknesses. Napoleon's ability to remain composed and adaptive became increasingly apparent. He adjusted troop formations, redistributed supplies, and ensured that communication lines remained open. Even in the midst of chaos, he maintained a level of organization that contrasted sharply with the disorder of the battlefield. His mind operated on multiple levels simultaneously, tactical, psychological, and strategically, allowing him to perceive patterns and opportunities invisible to others. In these early hours, the foundations of survival were laid. Calmness, adaptability, leadership, and awareness of both terrain and enemy were the pillars upon which the next 12 hours would rest. As noon approached, the physical and mental strain on the soldiers intensified. The sun, breaking fully through the clouds, reflected off wet ground, creating glare that challenged vision. Marching, firing, and holding positions required immense stamina, and fatigue began to take its toll. Injuries mounted, and the cries of the wounded mixed with the roar of artillery, creating a symphony of suffering that would mark the hours to come. For Napoleon, observing and managing these conditions was as critical as any strategic maneuver. The human element, resilience, fear, and determination of his soldiers would ultimately be as decisive as numbers or terrain. His awareness of this interplay set him apart from commanders who relied solely on brute force or rigid adherence to doctrine. By early afternoon, it became evident that the battle would not be decided quickly. 12 hours of sustained combat lay ahead, each moment fraught with danger and uncertainty. Napoleon's strategy, while adaptive, required patience. He could not force victory prematurely. He had to allow events to unfold, to exhaust the enemy, and to position his forces for a decisive strike. This patience, often underappreciated in accounts of his audacity, was a hallmark of his leadership. Recognizing when to act, when to wait, and how to inspire confidence amidst chaos was a subtle art, one that distinguished Napoleon from lesser commanders. Survival in this context was not passive, it was active, deliberate, and strategic. Throughout these hours, Napoleon's personal discipline and clarity of thought were as essential as the bravery of his troops. He took stock of ammunition, troop placement, and enemy movements continuously, recalibrating his approach as the battle evolved. He remained a visible figure to his soldiers, signaling presence, confidence, and calm amid the storm. Each gesture reinforced the unspoken message: though the battle was fierce and the enemy formidable, the French army had direction, leadership, and purpose. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Morale, even in the face of physical exhaustion and apparent setbacks, became a weapon as potent as any cannon or musket. As the first part of the day drew to a close, the stage was set for the extraordinary drama that would define the Battle of Marengo. Napoleon had endured the initial chaos, stabilized his army, and prepared for the pivotal decisions that would come in the afternoon. The foundations of survival: calm, adaptability, leadership, patience, and situational awareness had been firmly established. What remained was to convert these qualities into action, to seize the fleeting opportunities that could transform potential defeat into resounding victory. For now, however, the battlefield lay in tense equilibrium, silent promise of the hours of relentless struggle that were yet to come. In these early hours, the essence of Napoleon's genius and resilience was already evident, hinting at the legendary feats that history would remember and study for generations. The first hour of the Battle of Marengo descended upon the fields of northern Italy like a storm of fire and steel. The early morning tension, which had been almost unbearable in its anticipation, now erupted into the harsh, relentless reality of combat. The Austrian army, confident in its superior numbers, advanced in disciplined columns across the rain-softened plains, the rhythmic pounding of their boots echoing like distant thunder. Musket fire rang out in sporadic bursts at first, then grew into a continuous barrage, punctuated by the booming cannons that shook the earth and sent plumes of smoke spiraling into the sky. Napoleon Bonaparte, ever observant, watched the first waves of the Austrian advance with a measured eye, knowing that the opening moments of any battle were both dangerous and revealing. He understood that the initial chaos could easily dictate the tempo of the engagement. Arrayed carefully by Napoleon's own planning, initially tried to meet the Austrian advance with controlled volleys. Infantry squared their ranks, muskets at the ready, bayonets fixed, while artillery crews worked frantically to reload cannons between deafening blasts. The cacophony was overwhelming, serifying symphony of war that assaulted the senses and tested even the most seasoned soldiers' resolve. Smoke and dust mingled with the humidity of the June morning, reducing visibility and turning the battlefield into a shifting landscape of confusion and danger. Amidst this maelstrom, the French troops began to feel the first tremors of fear. Some hesitated, unsure whether to advance or hold their positions. Others gritted their teeth, fired their muskets, and tried to maintain cohesion in ranks that were already bending under pressure. Napoleon knew that if hesitation spread, it could trigger panic, and that panic could unravel the army in minutes. Napoleon himself moved along the lines, appearing where he was most needed, his presence an anchor in the chaos. His reputation had preceded him. Men who had fought under his command in Egypt, Italy, and elsewhere, knew the extraordinary combination of audacity and calm that he embodied. To the soldiers at Marengo, seeing Napoleon move confidently through smoke and gunfire, calmly directing artillery, encouraging officers, and even offering words to ordinary soldiers, was a psychological lifeline. Leadership in these moments became as vital as strategy. It was not sufficient for orders to be given. They had to be imbued with authority, clarity, and visible resolve. Napoleon understood this instinctively. Each step he took, each gesture, reassured his men and communicated that even in the teeth of chaos, there was a plan, and the plan had him at its center. The Austrians pressed their advantage, initially finding weak points in the French formations. Cavalry units attempted to flank and disrupt the French lines, while infantry columns pressed forward with bayonets aimed to break the ranks. The French soldiers, despite their training and courage, faced the terrifying realization that they were being tested not only in skill, but in endurance and nerve. Men fell to musket fire. Cries of pain, punctuated by the roar of artillery. The scent of gunpowder and blood filled the air. Horses reared and screamed as cavalry clashed. Wheels of cannons ground into mud, and officers shouted orders that were sometimes lost in the din. In this first hour, the battle was not yet about maneuver or decisive strikes. It was about survival, about maintaining the integrity of formations, and about preventing the tide of panic from sweeping through the French army. Napoleon's awareness extended beyond the immediate chaos. He constantly assessed the battlefield, noting the trajectories of artillery, the coordination of infantry, and the positions of both French and Austrian commanders. He recognized patterns in the Austrians' movements, subtle signs of overconfidence and overextension that might be exploited if he could hold the line long enough. Adaptability, already essential in the planning stages, became critical in real time. Orders were adjusted on the fly. Artillery was redeployed to exploit terrain advantages, and reserves were shifted to reinforce threatened sectors. This was a dynamic, living engagement. Napoleon's mind, operating at a relentless pace, sought to translate the chaos into controlled opportunity. The human dimension of the first hour was equally compelling. Individual soldiers experienced terror, adrenaline, and fleeting moments of clarity. A young French private, hearing the relentless roar of Austrian cannons for the first time, might have frozen in fear only to be steadied by the proximity of his comrades or the appearance of Napoleon himself. An experienced sergeant might issue commands under extreme stress, using every ounce of authority and knowledge to keep a small squad alive. Officers faced impossible decisions, whether to commit men to dangerous attacks, whether to hold the line under overwhelming fire, whether to risk their own lives to inspire troops. The first hour was as much a test of human courage as it was of military acumen. Soldiers discovered the limits of endurance, the capacity to act under extreme duress, and the necessity of trusting in leadership and in each other. Napoleon's personal engagement in this opening hour reflected a combination of tactical brilliance and psychological insight. He did not merely issue commands from a distance. He walked through musket fire, past skirmishes, and along crumbling lines, continuously assessing and encouraging. He noted which units were holding, which were faltering, and which could be relied upon for critical interventions. His presence reassured soldiers and emboldened officers. creating a sense that the chaos could be managed, and that each individual's contribution was both noticed and essential. The ability to inspire confidence amidst danger is a hallmark of extraordinary leadership, and in the first hour at Marengo, it was evident that Napoleon possessed this quality in abundance. The battlefield itself was a participant in the struggle. Rain-soaked fields slowed troop movements. Cannonballs churned the earth into mud, and smoke obscured vision, making coordination difficult. Units struggled to maintain formation, and soldiers became fatigued almost immediately. Each movement required concentration and effort. Every step a test of stamina and nerve. Terrain, weather, and visibility compounded the challenges, and commanders had to integrate these factors into their strategies in real time. Napoleon's capacity to read the environment, anticipate its effects on both his forces and the enemy, and adjust tactics accordingly, allowed him to maintain coherence where lesser commanders might have seen disorder spread uncontrollably. Amid the roar of battle, Napoleon also demonstrated an acute awareness of morale. He understood that fear could spread like wildfire and that maintaining cohesion was essential for survival. He encouraged his officers to remain calm, directed reinforcements to faltering units, and even took personal risks to inspire confidence among soldiers who had never before faced such intensity. In doing so, he reinforced the principle that leadership in combat is as much about presence and psychological influence as it is about strategy or tactics. The ability to maintain composure, to act decisively, and to embody confidence under fire was as crucial as any maneuver or volley of musketry. Communication during this first hour was chaotic but vital. Messages had to be delivered across smoke fields, over the roar of cannons and musket fire, often on horseback, or by runners weaving through danger. Orders could easily be misunderstood, misinterpreted, or delayed. Napoleon, aware of these limitations, relied on a combination of signals, the initiative of trusted officers, and his own presence to maintain coordination. This decentralized yet disciplined approach allowed the French army to respond flexibly to the unpredictable dynamics of combat, ensuring that even in moments of apparent disorder, control was not entirely lost. The psychological pressure on the Austrian forces was also a factor. While they had numerical superiority, they faced an opponent who was not merely reacting but actively shaping the battle. Napoleon's calm, decisive presence, combined with the resilience of French units, forced Austrian commanders to adapt, continuously creating uncertainty and stress in warfare. The perception of strength can be as impactful as actual force, and Napoleon skillfully leveraged this principle in the first hour by maintaining a steady, commanding presence and keeping French units organized under pressure. He imposed a form of psychological discipline on both his own troops and his adversaries. The first hour of the Battle of Marengo set the tone for the grueling hours to follow. It was a period defined by intense combat, extraordinary human endurance, and the delicate interplay between fear and courage. Soldiers experienced the raw realities of war, the sights, sounds, and smells of battle, while commanders balanced strategy with the unpredictable human element. Napoleon's genius, evident in his calmness, adaptability, leadership, and psychological insight, allowed the French army not merely to survive, but to remain poised for the decisive moments that would come later in the day. The opening hour was chaotic and deadly, yet it was also the proving ground where the foundations of survival, strategy, and ultimate victory were laid. Through this crucible, Napoleon's forces would endure, learn, and prepare for the counterattacks that would define their place in history. As the minutes ticked by, French and Austrian soldiers alike felt the relentless rhythm of combat pressing down upon them. Cannon fire shook the ground, musket volleys tore through ranks, and the cries of the wounded filled the air. Yet, amid this ferocious storm, the French army remained coherent enough to respond to orders, adjust positions, and resist complete collapse. Napoleon moved tirelessly along the lines, assessing, instructing, and inspiring. The first hour, though chaotic, was a testament to the resilience of the French forces and to the commanding presence of their leader. It revealed the interplay of strategy, human endurance, and leadership that would ultimately define the outcome of the battle. In those first 60 minutes, Marengo had become not only a contest of arms but also a crucible of human spirit, determination, and genius, setting the stage for the extraordinary struggle and eventual triumph that lay ahead. As the morning chaos of Marengo raged on, the battle seemed to teeter precariously between order and utter disarray. The first volleys of musket fire and cannon blasts had already inflicted losses on both sides, yet the tide of the fight remained uncertain. Napoleon Bonaparte, standing amidst the smoke, mud, and clamor, was acutely aware that rigid adherence to a preset plan could be fatal. The battlefield, in its violent and unpredictable dynamism, demanded not merely preparation, but adaptability. Napoleon understood that while armies could be drilled to respond to commands, the realities of war, the terrain, the weather, the morale of troops, and the instinctive decisions of individual soldiers were variables that could never be fully controlled. Thus, the true test of command lay in the ability to perceive these shifting elements and to manipulate them in real time, converting apparent disadvantages into opportunities for decisive action. Napoleon's keen eye scanned the battlefield with a level of precision that seemed almost uncanny. He noted the formations of the Austrian troops, observing their flanks, the pace of their advance, and subtle discrepancies in their alignment. While at first glance the enemy appeared organized and confident, Napoleon detected imperfections, gaps between columns, overextended lines, and officers whose gestures betrayed uncertainty. These were not mere trivialities. In the calculus of battle, even a minor lapse in coordination could cascade into catastrophic vulnerability. Napoleon's mind worked through countless scenarios, constantly asking, "If I act now, what openings will this create? If I wait, what weaknesses might emerge in the enemy lines?" This continuous mental simulation allowed him to make decisions that were responsive, precise, and opportunistic rather than reactive or rigidly predetermined. The French army itself was under tremendous pressure. Infantry formations strained to hold positions under the weight of Austrian fire. Artillery crews scrambled to reload cannons while under attack, and cavalry units faced the dual challenge of maneuvering in muddy terrain and avoiding encirclement. Soldiers' morale was tested not only by the physical dangers, but by the sheer intensity of sensory assault, the deafening roar of cannon fire, the constant crack of musket shots, the cries of the wounded, and the thick smoke that obscured vision. Amid this turmoil, Napoleon's adaptability became critical. He issued orders that were responsive to the evolving circumstances, redirecting artillery to cover exposed flanks, reinforcing units that were faltering, and repositioning reserves to exploit weaknesses as they appeared. His decisions were not impulsive. They were grounded in an acute awareness of cause and effect, balancing risk with opportunity. One notable aspect of Napoleon's adaptability at Marengo was his use of terrain as a strategic asset. While the plains appeared flat and featureless, to the untrained eye, Napoleon recognized the subtle undulations, shallow depressions, and clusters of trees as elements that could influence the outcome of specific engagements. Artillery positioned on even a slight rise could dominate a stretch of open field, while cavalry could exploit muddy depressions to funnel enemy advances into kill zones. Napoleon's orders for troop placement were constantly adjusted in response to these terrain considerations, ensuring that every cannon, every infantry squad, and every cavalry charge operated in maximum synergy with the environment. This nuanced understanding of terrain allowed the French forces to maintain coherence even as the battle threatened to overwhelm them. Another crucial element of adaptability was Napoleon's awareness of timing. The Austrian forces, confident from their initial advances, had pushed forward aggressively. Their overextension created openings that could be exploited, seized at precisely the right moment. Napoleon, recognizing this, resisted the temptation to launch a hasty counterattack. He understood that acting prematurely could squander the advantage and expose his forces to devastating retaliation. Instead, he allowed the Austrians to advance to the point where their formations were stretched and fatigued, positioning the French army to deliver maximum impact when the counterstrike finally came. This patient approach required not only strategic insight, but psychological fortitude, as it involved enduring the sight of his troops under stress and the threat of apparent defeat, all while maintaining the confidence of those same troops that victory was still within reach. The first signs of effective adaptability appeared in Napoleon's management of reserves. He did not commit all forces at once. Rather, he held units in readiness, moving them flexibly to reinforce sectors that were faltering or to exploit emerging vulnerabilities in the Austrian lines. This approach exemplified a principle that would define Napoleon's campaigns: the preservation and judicious deployment of strength in a dynamic and uncertain environment. Reserves were not static. They were living instruments of tactical flexibility, capable of shifting the balance of engagement when utilized with precision. By keeping key elements of his army mobile and responsive, Napoleon ensured that the French forces could react to threats without being wholly reactive, maintaining a degree of initiative even under sustained pressure. Napoleon's interaction with his officers was another vital component of adaptability. He relied on a network of trusted subordinates who could interpret and execute his intent even as conditions evolved. Orders were often given in general terms, leaving room for officers to exercise judgment in the moment. This decentralized approach allowed units to respond to immediate threats while still aligning with the overarching strategic vision. Napoleon's ability to trust his subordinates, combined with rigorous training and clear communication, a flexible command structure, capable of navigating the unpredictable dynamics of battle. In the chaos of Marengo, this structure prevented disarray from cascading into catastrophe and allowed the French army to maintain cohesion despite sustained assaults. The Austrian army's initial aggression, while formidable, began to reveal cracks as the first hour progressed. Their numerical superiority, which initially gave them confidence, now became a source of rigidity. Columns advanced with precision, but lacked the flexibility to respond rapidly to unexpected developments. When French artillery inflicted unexpected losses or a unit maneuvered unexpectedly, Austrian commanders were forced into reactive adjustments, creating brief but exploitable lapses in coordination. Napoleon's attention to these nuances allowed him to calibrate French responses, applying pressure at points of vulnerability while maintaining overall defensive stability. Adaptability in this context was both proactive and responsive, a continuous interplay between observing, analyzing, and executing decisions that maximized advantage under the constraints of the battlefield. Psychology played an equally important role in adaptability. Napoleon understood that soldiers' perceptions could be as influential as actual movements. He used visible gestures, the timing of reinforcements, and the positioning of key units to convey confidence and strength even when the situation appeared precarious. Conversely, he observed the Austrians for signs of hesitation, fatigue, or uncertainty, adjusting French tactics to exploit these psychological fissures. The battle was not simply a contest of numbers or firepower. It was a complex interaction of human perception, morale, and decision-making under extreme stress. Napoleon's capacity to manage both the tangible and intangible elements of the battlefield was central to his survival and the preservation of his army's fighting capability. As the first hour drew toward its conclusion, the practical manifestations of adaptability became increasingly evident. French units that had initially faltered were reinforced, reformed, and repositioned. Artillery fire, previously static and reactive, now targeted emerging weak points in Austrian lines with deadly efficiency. Cavalry units, instead of charging headlong, maneuvered to threaten flanks and create tactical dilemmas for the enemy. The battlefield, once a chaotic tableau of sound and smoke, began to take on a sense of controlled fluidity. Napoleon's ability to orchestrate this dynamic environment in real time was a testament to both his preparation and his responsiveness. He demonstrated that adaptability was not a single act, but a continuous process, a cycle of observation, decision, and action repeated thousands of times across the battlefield in the lives of men and horses. The movement of artillery and the trajectories of musket balls and cannonballs. Napoleon also demonstrated remarkable adaptability in the face of unexpected challenges. Communication lines were imperfect, messengers were delayed or killed, signals misinterpreted, and sudden shifts in the enemy's movements threatened to upend his carefully considered plans. In response, Napoleon relied on improvisation informed by experience. He repositioned units without awaiting formal approval, issued orders verbally while moving across dangerous zones, and even adjusted his personal location to maximize visibility and influence. This fluid responsiveness ensured that the French army remained coordinated despite the inherent chaos of battle. The limitations of contemporary command and control were starkly evident on the battlefield. In essence, adaptability at Marengo was a combination of foresight, observation, improvisation, and decisive action executed under extreme pressure. The opening phase also tested the limits of endurance and cohesion among the French troops. Soldiers had to maintain formation, execute complex maneuvers, reload weapons under fire, and sustain morale despite visible losses and the terrifying presence of the enemy. Napoleon's adaptability extended deeply into these human dimensions as well. He adjusted the tempo of engagement, the deployment of reserves, and the rotation of fatigued units to sustain combat effectiveness over time. By managing not only the tactical but also the physiological and psychological state of his army, Napoleon ensured that adaptability was embedded at every level, from individual soldiers to entire regiments. By the conclusion of this initial phase, a critical insight had emerged. Adaptability was not merely a reaction to adversity, but a proactive, creative force capable of shaping the battle itself. Napoleon had preserved his army through keen observation, resolute leadership, and flexible strategy. He had identified weaknesses in the Austrian lines, anticipated their movements, and prepared his forces to exploit openings the moment they appeared. Though tested and strained, French troops remained cohesive and responsive. The battlefield, once dominated by chaotic momentum, now reflected a subtle but growing order, guided by the vision and adaptability of its commander. In these formative moments, the very principles that would carry Napoleon through 12 grueling hours of near-constant combat were already in operation. Calmness under fire, rapid situational assessment, dynamic repositioning, psychological insight, and the flexible deployment of forces all combined to forge a resilient and responsive army. Adaptability was not a static attribute, but an active process continuously renewed and recalibrated as the battle unfolded. It served both as the shield that preserved French forces and as the mechanism through which opportunity could be seized. In these early hours, Napoleon demonstrated that true military genius is measured not solely by audacious attacks or spectacular victories, but by the ability to survive, endure, and manipulate the complexities of the battlefield in real time. This first phase of adaptability set the stage for what would follow. The French army had weathered the initial assaults, stabilized its lines, and begun identifying opportunities for strategic exploitation. Napoleon's capacity to read the battlefield, act decisively under pressure, and anticipate enemy weaknesses would be repeatedly tested as the engagement deepened. Yet the foundation had already been laid through continuous observation, flexible tactics, psychological insight, and disciplined execution of complex maneuvers. Napoleon and his army had proven that adaptability was not merely a tool for survival, it was a decisive instrument of potential victory. The unfolding drama of Marengo had entered its next phase, and the seeds of triumph, carefully sown through real-time adaptability, were beginning to take root. The hours at Marengo dragged on with relentless intensity. By early afternoon, the initial chaos of morning had given way to a prolonged, grinding contest in which neither side could claim a decisive advantage. The sun climbed high in the sky, its glare reflecting off wet fields and the metallic surfaces of muskets and cannon barrels. The air hung thick with smoked acrid scent of gunpowder and blood, mingling with damp earth, creating a sensory assault that tested the outer limits of human endurance. Soldiers on both sides moved with weary determination, muscles aching from hours of marching, firing, and reloading. The first surge of adrenaline had faded, replaced by the steady, numbing fatigue that accompanies sustained combat. Every breath, every movement, every decision carried weight far beyond the immediate moment. This was the crucible in which resilience and patience were tested, and it was here that Napoleon's genius revealed itself most clearly for Napoleon. The opening chaos had been a test of adaptability, but the hours that followed demanded a different mastery, patience. He understood that impulsive action could prove disastrous. Though the Austrians had advanced aggressively in the morning, creating exploitable gaps through overextension, remained formidable, with considerable strength intact. To counter their pressure effectively, Napoleon needed to wait for the precise moment when fatigue and disorganization would render Austrian lines vulnerable to a devastating blow. The art of patience in warfare is not passive. It is an active engagement with time, a careful calibration of action and restraint. Napoleon grasped this intuitively. He resisted the instinct to launch an immediate counterattack, recognizing that true opportunity lay in timing, observation, and the disciplined endurance of his forces. French soldiers, fully aware of the day's escalating intensity, faced immense physical and psychological challenges. Their bodies strained under continuous exertion, feet blistered from marching, arms and shoulders stiff from handling muskets and bayonets, lungs burning from smoke and effort. The weight of equipment, the burden of supplies, and the constant vigilance required to respond to threats compounded their exhaustion. Yet the human spirit, especially when fortified by strong leadership and shared purpose, can endure extraordinary hardship. Napoleon's presence was essential to sustaining morale. He moved among the ranks, offering encouragement and closely observing his men's condition, his gestures conveying both authority and reassurance. His calmness proved infectious, reinforcing the unspoken message that the army could survive, endure, and ultimately seize the moment for decisive action. The Austrians, despite their early momentum, were not immune to the toll of prolonged combat. Their initial confidence, once the engine of their aggressive advance began to erode under cumulative strain. Officers issued orders met increasingly with hesitation. Columns trudged more slowly across sodden fields, and unit cohesion started to fray. Though numerically superior, their rigid formations hindered rapid adaptation. Napoleon observed these signs with sharp perception, recognizing that numerical strength could become a liability if pressed without regard for physical and psychological limits. Patience, in this context, was not mere defense, it was a calculated anticipation of the enemy's self-inflicted vulnerabilities. His understanding of patience extended to reserve deployment. Unlike the opening clashes where immediate reactions were vital, the prolonged struggle required judicious allocation of forces. He held key units in readiness, shifting them subtly to reinforce pressured sectors or prepare for future opportunities. These reserves served both as a tactical safety net and a latent instrument of counteroffensive power. Through careful management, Napoleon ensured the French army remained coherent and responsive. capable of weathering combat's ebb and flow while staying poised to strike when conditions turned favorable. This measured use of strength exemplified the fusion of patience and strategic foresight, a hallmark of Napoleon's command. Equally vital was patience's psychological dimension. Soldiers in sustained combat are prone to panic, despair, or reckless aggression, all of which threaten unit cohesion. Napoleon's steady presence countered these tendencies, projecting calm and reinforcing the belief that each man's role mattered. He cultivated a collective focus that transcended individual fear, recognizing that morale is both fragile and resilient, shaped by perception, leadership, and trust. Thus, patience functioned as both strategy and psychological tool, enabling the army to endure hardship, maintain discipline, and preserve the unity essential for coming decisive moments. As afternoon wore on, subtle shifts emerged in the battle's dynamics. Austrian lines, despite early gains, showed signs of strain. Their formations, stretched thin and fatigued, grew less responsive to French maneuvers. Commanders issued orders that arrived late or were misunderstood. Small gaps opened between units. Napoleon noted these fissures with intense interest but resisted exploiting them prematurely. He knew hasty action could expose his own troops to unnecessary risk and allow the Austrians time to recover. True patience meant waiting for the perfect convergence of factors when enemy fatigue, disarray, and overconfidence could be turned against them with maximum effect. Terrain, exhaustion, and morale further shaped Napoleon's approach. The plains of Marengo, though seemingly flat, featured gentle depressions, low rises, and scattered groves that influenced movement, visibility, and positioning. Muddy ground slowed advances, especially for cavalry, and artillery required constant adjustment for uneven terrain. Already exhausted soldiers struggled to hold formation or execute intricate maneuvers. Napoleon's awareness of these elements informed his decisions, allowing him to synchronize patience with preparation. He did not wait idly. Instead, he actively repositioned units, fine-tuned artillery placements, and monitored enemy dispositions, ensuring the French army would be primed to exploit every advantage the moment the tide turned. Communication during this period of restraint was another critical factor. Orders had to traverse smoke-choked, chaotic fields, often delayed or distorted by noise, distance, and battlefield confusion. Napoleon relied on trusted officers and personal oversight to maintain coordination. Messages were timed carefully, signals standardized and reinforced, key unit movements closely tracked. This blend of structured communication and adaptive supervision allowed the French army to respond to evolving conditions without losing cohesion. Patience, then, was not inaction, but a disciplined orchestration of forces and information, preserving flexibility while awaiting the optimal moment to engage. The physical and mental toll on soldiers continued to mount. Hours of combat eroded stamina, sharpened anxiety, and tested resolve. Some were wounded, others neared collapse. Yet, leadership and disciplined structure enabled the army to hold together. Napoleon's ability to inspire confidence became as crucial as tactical precision. He understood human endurance as a finite resource requiring management as careful as that of ammunition or artillery. By pacing the fight and bolstering morale, he ensured his men retained the capacity to execute future maneuvers. Meanwhile, The Austrians remained aggressive, but increasingly strained. Their advances slowed, columns stretched thin, coordination faltered. Napoleon recognized that fatigue and sustained pressure would inevitably create exploitable weaknesses. Patience thus became both defensive and offensive, allowing the enemy to overextend, tire, and reveal gaps. He positioned French forces to deliver a crushing blow the instant the moment arrived. This interplay of endurance, observation, and calculated restraint defined Napoleon's strategic patience at Marengo. Psychologically, patience was a constant. Negotiation between apparent vulnerability and hidden strength. Soldiers on both sides felt the weight of prolonged combat, fear, uncertainty, and anticipation clouding judgment. Napoleon's role was to manage these pressures, maintaining control and purpose within his ranks while amplifying strain among the enemy. The ability to endure setbacks without panic, to spot openings without rushing, and to inspire sustained resilience under duress became the defining trait of the French response during this phase. As hours passed, French endurance began yielding subtle advantages. Previously pushed back units regained cohesion. Artillery found greater precision. Cavalry shifted to threatened flanks. Napoleon's vigilant oversight allowed these incremental gains to accumulate, setting the stage for a decisive afternoon counterstroke. The principle was clear. In prolonged combat, patience is not passive waiting. It is the active cultivation of conditions that enable decisive action. Victory is often forged not in impulsive bursts, but in quiet, deliberate preparation. Napoleon's patience extended even to his personal conduct. He moved deliberately, assessing developments, reinforcing units, adjusting plans, never showing haste or alarm. His composed presence modeled the values of endurance and observation, proving them as vital as aggression. By embodying patience, he reinforced the psychological and strategic framework needed for ultimate success. These early afternoon hours thus became both a trial and a demonstration of leadership, endurance, and foresight. By mid-afternoon, the slow accrual of advantage grew evident. Austrian lines, though still strong, showed cracks in morale and coordination. French soldiers, though weary, held firm and stayed ready. Napoleon had positioned reserves to exploit emerging gaps. Artillery covered key approaches. Cavalry stood prepared for timely strikes. Strategic patience had transformed a precarious standoff into fertile ground for opportunity. The foundation for a turning point was laid, though its realization still demanded endurance and exact timing. Thus, the principle of patience under pressure at Marengo encompassed multiple layers: soldierly endurance, precise maneuver timing, enemy weakness, exploitation, and management of physical and mental strain. Napoleon's genius lay not just in reacting to events, but in orchestrating conditions that would magnify the impact of future actions. Every hour of restraint, every thoughtful deployment, every display of calm leadership contributed to the reversal of fortune that would define the battle. Through patience, the French army preserved its strength, maintained morale, and readied itself for the climactic counterattack. As the sun arced across the sky, pressure never relented. Soldiers fired, marched, and held positions amid musket volleys, artillery barrages, and cavalry threats. Fatigue and fear were ever present, but discipline and leadership kept the army intact. Napoleon, ever watchful, tracked both his men and the enemy, ensuring the conditions for a turning point steadily matured. Patience was no longer passive. It had become an active, dynamic, process-sustaining capability, detecting opportunity and preparing for decisive action. The afternoon at Marengo stood as testament to the power of endurance, strategy, and psychological command in the furnace of prolonged battle. By the time the sun began its descent, the field bore the scars of relentless struggle, smoke lingering in the air, cries of the wounded echoing, earth torn by movement and fire. Yet amid the devastation, the French army remained coherent, alert, and ready. Napoleon's patience had allowed him to withstand apparent crisis, manage the compounding effects of exhaustion and fear, and position his forces for the decisive stroke. In the prolonged trial of Marengo, he proved that victory is often prepared in hours of quiet observation, disciplined restraint, and unwavering endurance by both leader and army alike. What began as a test of adaptability had evolved into a masterclass in strategic patience, laying the groundwork for the extraordinary reversal that would immortalize this battle in history. By late afternoon, tension reached unbearable heights. The French army seemed suspended between hope and despair. Hours of combat had drained men, horses, and commanders alike. Fields once open for maneuver now lay churned to mud, littered with the morning's fallen. Smoke hung like a shroud, blurring the chaos of gunfire, cannon blasts, and cavalry charges. The Austrians, having surged forward earlier, now appeared ascendant. French infantry fell back in several sectors. Artillery positions were lost. Morale among some units wavered under unrelenting strain. Yet, in this dire moment, Napoleon Bonaparte remained composed, his mind ceaselessly calculating, observing, anticipating. He knew the moment for decisive action neared, and that timing and precision would dictate the battle's fate. He had prepared for this. All morning and into the afternoon, he kept mobile reserves out of direct combat, positioning them to strike where Austrian lines thinned. These were not just backups, they were instruments of strategic opportunity, capable of delivering concentrated force at the war's pivotal instant. Napoleon's genius lay in reading not only troop movements but the psychological and physical state of both armies. He saw fatigue setting into Austrian ranks, columns, once sharp, now stretched and disjointed. Officers gave orders met with delay or confusion. Small gaps fractured their cohesion. He knew these weaknesses could be exploited, but only with flawless timing and iron discipline. The arrival of General Louis Desaix with fresh reinforcements marked the battle's turning point. Desaix brought not only manpower but renewed morale at the very hour when French exhaustion threatened collapse. The sight of determined new troops flooding the field electrified weary soldiers. Those retreating or barely holding ground drew fresh courage, knowing they were not abandoned and that their commander had foreseen this moment. Napoleon seized the opportunity with lightning decisiveness. He instantly assessed where men could strike hardest, identifying Austrian vulnerabilities and reinforcing faltering French units. The battlefield, long ruled by fatigue and momentum, now braced for sudden reversal. Orchestrated with clarity and purpose, his orders rang out with urgency yet precision. Infantry pivoted, to hammer overstretched Austrian flanks. Artillery shifted to blast dense enemy columns. Cavalry wheeled to threaten rear lines and block retreat. These movements unfolded with remarkable coordination, testament to French discipline and Napoleon's command structure. The Austrians, caught utterly off guard, reeled. Having poured energy into their morning assault, they stood exposed to a coordinated counterblow. The shock of facing fresh, well-led troops shattered their confidence, breeding confusion that French speed and precision magnified. As Dyseix's forces engaged, the French clawed back lost ground. Artillery, once defensive, became an engine of aggression, shattering weak points and scattering formations. Cannons thundered, hurling destruction into Austrian ranks as disciplined infantry advanced. Exhausted Austrians, now assailed from multiple directions by fresh troops, buckled under the strain. Panic rippled through their lines. Officers fought to restore order as musket fire, artillery barrages, and the dread of encirclement overwhelmed cohesion. Napoleon's timing was impeccable. His counterattack struck at the precise moment Austrian fatigue, overextension, and disorder peaked. Cavalry proved decisive. Napoleon had held horsemen ready to exploit flank and rear weaknesses. Though their mounts were weary, concentrated charges tore into vulnerable infantry, sowing chaos. Sabers flashed where enemy cohesion frayed. Impact immediate and devastating. Stretched Austrian units collapsed, men fleeing or surrendering. The synchronized might of artillery, infantry, and cavalry executed with surgical precision showcased Napoleon's mastery of combined arms. Chaos gave way to controlled momentum as French forces pressed their advantage. Dyseix's intervention proved fatal to Austrian hopes. His troops, swift and purposeful, plugged critical gaps and stiffened wavering lines. Retreating soldiers stabilized, regrouped, and joined the offensive. The Austrians, blindsided by this sudden influx and Napoleon's tactical brilliance, could not mount an effective response. The psychological reversal was total. Troops who believed victory, theirs now faced ruin. Commanders scrambled reactively, late to save disintegrating formations. Momentum swung irrevocably to the French. The human dimension of this turnaround cannot be overstated. Soldiers swung from near despair to surging confidence. Fear and fatigue yielded, however briefly, to adrenaline and purpose. Officers gained clarity to execute complex maneuvers. Units, once fragmented, now acted in concert. The battlefield became a living system. Artillery, infantry, cavalry, and leadership interacting to multiply each other's power. Napoleon's genius lay in conducting this symphony, aligning timing, placement, and psychological impact to forge overwhelming advantage. As the French counterattack surged, the Austrian army unraveled. Formations worn down by hours of strain and overextension crumbled under coordinated pressure. Units fled in disarray. Gunners abandoned cannons. Cavalry charges dissolved before French resistance. Napoleon pressed without mercy, exploiting every gap, every hesitation. What had been a scene of prolonged uncertainty transformed into a theater of controlled aggression, proof of how well-timed leadership, layered atop patience, adaptability, and insight, can reshape destiny. Napoleon himself stood at the heart of this reversal, moving along the lines, issuing commands, watching developments, inspiring through example. His composure, rapid judgment, and real-time coordination were vital to sustaining French momentum. Soldiers later recalled how seeing him calmly directing amid chaos filled them with resolve. In this climactic phase, leadership was both tactical and psychologically forging the discipline and morale essential not just to endure but to triumph.